it's good to always say thank you twice. So, Susanna, thank you so much. Michael, the library is wonderful, and the embassy is doing its job. So it's great. It's also in this place, with that picture, it's a humbling experience. It's also, I think, an obligation. So with that in mind, I actually prepared, I don't usually sort of speak from text, but I thought because of this, I probably should. So I apologize if I'm going to look down a little bit at this, but I wanted to get it right. So again, thank you so much for this, for the introduction and for being here with you. This is an important occasion. I think it's good for us to just sit back and recall history. Especially these days of May, because 70 years ago, it was a dramatic time in Europe. And just before that, even more dramatic, if I may add. So if we consider the future of this region today, it's important to recall lessons of history, and particularly to recall America's relationship with Europe over the last decades. That's a relationship, if we're honest, that's been marked by cycles of retrenchment and engagement. And we face, in certain times, certain cycles, we always face, again, a choice, whether we engage or step back. I think the Marshall Plan offers us some lessons in that regard. So if we recall the closing days, first, of World War II in Europe, 72 years ago, dramatic days of liberation. Unfortunately, in most of Central Europe, liberation from the grip of the Third Reich did not lead to freedom, as it did in Western Europe, and in Austria, and in Germany itself. By the end of May 1945, General Patton's army and his troops had already withdrawn from Western Bohemia, which they had liberated, leaving the Red Army in control not only over Czech and Slovak lands, but throughout the region. The hope of liberation soon gave way to the sober reality of foreign rule in a new Cold War. America's withdrawal from this region was part of a general retrenchment by the United States from global commitments and responsibilities in those initial post-war years. We tend to forget that after World War II, America stepped back from its world commitments, and it was understandable if you think about it. American soldiers, the society that deployed them, very far from American shores, not only here but in the Pacific, they ached for their return. They wanted them home. They wanted to get victory's dividend, and they wanted to build a better future at home. So after sacrificing so much and so many for Europe, Americans are ready to look homeward. The popular mood was clear at that time. It was time to put America first. Meanwhile, Europe was prostrate. It was devastated by its wars. It was unable to generate the capacity for a future, certainly not a peaceful one. Between 1945 and 1948, despite the fact that the U.S. was stepping back, it provided $15 billion in those dollars, a lot of money, however you count it. We had a senator one time who said, when you talk about this, you're talking real money. But the U.S., it's important to recall that in the time just after World War II, the United States provided $15 billion in assistance to Europe. It was a huge amount. But by early 1948, it was clear that American largesse alone, pocketbook diplomacy alone, was not enough, that Europe had not revived, despite all the money. And it remained traumatized and divided both within its societies and among them. It was only then, as the concerns about Europe's future grew even greater, that American leaders understood that the United States could not retrench, could not step back to obligations, that checkbook diplomacy didn't cut it. and it was not adequate to safeguard U.S. interests and values that it had just sacrificed so much for in 2 world wars. It was only then that a new cycle really began with General Marshall's speech. He gave the speech in June 5th, 1947, but the money didn't come until about 9 months later. But the lesson that he had in that speech was that the United States would engage actively on the European continent. It would contribute as it could to Europe's better future, but Europeans had to lead the way. That was the difference. If Europeans wanted American support, they had to cast aside their divisions and they demonstrate how they would build their future together. That was the plan in the Marshall Plan. America will fuel Europe's recovery. America would stand with Europe, but Europe had to work together to chart the way forward. The Marshall Plan in the end was a tremendous success. Its legacy continues to pay dividends for our relations today. And without the Marshall Plan, the Czech Republic's revival, which we'll come to, as Michael said, a bittersweet story. But the Czech Republic played, the country of Czechoslovakia played an amazing role, which maybe sometimes is not actually appreciated in the history. But I want to return to the central point that today everyone remembers the money behind the Marshall Plan. There are always calls today everywhere in the world, let's have a new Marshall Plan. And mainly people mean the money. Give me the money. But in the end, though, the Marshall Plan was $13 billion. It was less money than the United States had just invested in Europe in only 2 years between the end of World War II and the beginning of Marshall's plan. So it wasn't about the money in the end. It was not the money, it was the plan that made the plan. And one has to remember what was the point of that again. Its true legacy for Europe's better future was that the Europeans not only had to tell the Americans how they would use their money, they would have to do it together. And the effect was to galvanize the European movement. It was to make real and practical what had only been a dream, a real European community. This month we also commemorate this success, the 67th anniversary of the Schuman Plan, marking the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the forerunner to what we now know as the European Union, whose founding treaty in Rome, signed 60 years ago, we commemorated earlier this spring. So built on this newfound European engagement, the U.S. and its partners forged other institutions. We forged the GATT, now the WTO, the OECD, which was predecessor administered the Marshall Plan, and NATO. The Atlantic Alliance, if we think about it, NATO created an umbrella under which Europeans who had just killed each other massively in 2 world wars could turn to each other and build their future together rather than looking over their shoulder at each other's security policy. They started to build a common policy. So NATO and the European Union, frankly, are very synergistic and really linked, even though we don't ever talk about it that way. And one has to keep that in mind as we think about the future. And because of that, we together produced unparalleled peace and prosperity for half a century, but for only half a continent. So the United States, I think, as everyone knows, offered the Marshall Plan to all of Europe, including the Soviet Union. 16 West European countries accepted, as did Czechoslovakia. But after meeting with Stalin on the matter, the Czech Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk came back and said he had to turn down the offer. He said, "I went to Moscow as the foreign minister of an independent sovereign state. I returned as a lackey of the Soviet government." But signals from Czechoslovakia, as I said before, proved decisive actually to the Marshall Plan's approval. because at the time, the majority in the US Congress was composed of those we today would call America Firsters, who saw no reason, frankly, to invest more money in Europe that had just brought devastation to itself and to all of the world. Congress delayed funding the Marshall Plan for 9 months. It was a bitter debate. It was unclear. Marshall just gave a speech. The Congress approves the money. Until late February 1948, when the coup in Czechoslovakia galvanized Americans into action to realize that we had to act and approve the funds and get this plan going. But unfortunately, only for those countries free to accept American assistance. And that, as we know, continued disputes over that assistance soon turned into walls and curtains separating people. And Europe's vibrant middle dissolved into two artificial Europes. One we called West, one we called East. Young Czechs grew up knowing more about Moscow than Vienna. Young Viennese knew more about Milan and Munich than Bratislava or Budapest. And Hamburgers and Frankfurters knew all about London and nothing about Leipzig. And then 28 years ago, the Hungarian Foreign Minister, Gyula Horn, and the Austrian Foreign Minister, Alois Mock, who I should say is a graduate of our school, snipped open the Iron Curtain. And that event gave voice to a singular message that all the people on the streets here, all through Central Europe, all of their banners turned into one message. We want to rejoin Europe. We want to be part of the Europe we've always been part of, except of where the Red Army happened to be in the summer of 1945. And if we just remember that, the message that, the streets, all the people in their Trabants and Skodas and Ladas, that's what they wanted, just to be part again of the greater whole. And Central Europe drove the revolution. I think of this man, and very important. And it's important to realize that, again, the signals from Central Europe were decisive for decisions in world capitals about what to do about the future. It was an earthquake. It shook the continent and its institutions. I'd argue it's still shaking. And the message is that of opportunity and obligation. Opportunity to build a continent that is truly whole, free, and at peace, but the obligation to see it through. So in those waning days of the Cold War, however, for those old enough to recall it, we again faced a cycle. We faced a moment of choice. Do we engage or do we retrench? Do we step forward or back? It was not clear what America would do at that time. In the heart of Central Europe, we decided to engage. The United States and its partners seized history's opportunity and, I believe, met our obligations. We helped Germany to unify in peace. We incorporated Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary to join our institutions. It was a dramatic, wonderful time. But at the same time, we failed history's lesson in southeastern Europe, because violence began to engulf the Balkans, and there we stepped back. In the famous words of one of our former secretaries of state, good American English, "We ain't got no dog in that fight." And it was echoed by the Luxembourg foreign minister, who had the presidency of the European community at the time. This will be Europe's hour to bring peace to the Balkans. So our failure to resist our temptation, our historic temptation toward retrenchment, and our joint failure to understand our commitment and America's role, not just a power in Europe, but a European power, amounted to the greatest collective failure of the West since World War II. And it was only after great tragedy, marked this year by the 22nd anniversary of the genocidal acts in Srebrenica, that the United States and our European partners understand again the lessons they had learned and lost 40 years earlier. But once again, we applied those lessons. We worked together. We did bring the Balkan conflicts to an end. We set that part of the continent on the road to rejoin Europe. That message, still the message that shakes the continent. A Europe where war simply doesn't happen, where democracy, rule of rights, respect for human rights, and prosperity prevail. In that time, once again, Western, this time though primarily European, financial assistance was important. But once again, more important than the money was the message to those countries. Stability can't be imposed from the outside. It has to be built from within. The countries in question there and a bit east of you are likely to leave their turbulent history behind only if they're committed to create conditions by which they can be integrated into Europe, into the broader mainstream of European and Euro-Atlantic institutions, by resolving bilateral disputes, ethnic tensions, engaging in true political and economic reforms, respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, the rule of law, and working together rather than standing apart. So if we look at 70 years, I think we can be proud. But we cannot be complacent, because despite our efforts, Europe is not yet whole, nor at peace, nor is it free. And once again, we risk forgetting the lessons of our history. Europe's West is facing a conflation of crises. Migration, terrorism, Brexit, low and uneven growth, significant youth unemployment, and debt challenges in many countries, and the cancer of illiberal democracy, which I think is, if I may say, particularly relevant to this part of Europe. But it's unsettled all of European politics, economics, and European security policies. And Europe's south and its east are faring no better. Turmoil continues in the Western Balkans, endangering all of the progress we had achieved. A decade after the EU offered its Eastern Partnership to 6 countries in the East, let's think about it. Russia's invaded 2 of them. It's positioned Russian forces in 5 of them. Belarus is no longer known as the last dictatorship in Europe, not because it's not a dictatorship, but because other dictatorships have joined it. And the cancer of illiberal democracy, so-called, is really infecting Europe's body politic. So right before our eyes, once again, 2 artificial Europes are rising. We have a turbulent gray zone to the east and to the southeast, whose people do not know where their future lies. And we have an inward-looking, fractious disunion to the west, whose people seem to have forgotten why they ever joined together to build, quote, an ever closer union. I would be remiss if I didn't include the US in this narrative, because we're not alone. Europe, of course, is not alone in its dysfunction. So the election of Donald Trump, an anti-establishment economic nationalist, as the 45th President of the United States, of course, has rocked the very foundation of the Transatlantic Partnership. Trump's victory, for my European friends, I believe was a victory for what I call Jacksonian America. It's an important political current that's always been in American society, but almost always baffles non-Americans. So it's hard to explain it. It's usually not covered very well outside of the United States, and that's why people are surprised sometimes when you get what you get. But so of all of America's great political traditions, Jacksonianism is perhaps the most least well understood abroad. But it is the America that has always rejected elitist opinion, has been suspicious of centralized authority in Washington. It supports a strong military, but it's very skeptical of what they would call do-gooding, whether that means welfare at home or foreign aid abroad. Jacksonianism, if you want to call it that, has always been with us. It's named after Andrew Jackson, a president in the early 19th century. But it was an important movement during the 1940s when the U.S. faced again the choice, do we engage or do we step back on the eve of World War II? And that was the original America First movement, for those people who said, not with us, we don't want to be part of that. But Jacksonian influence was also very evident in President Roosevelt's message to the Axis powers that the only terms of negotiation were unconditional surrender. It was visible in George W. Bush's message after the attacks of September 11th that, quote, you are with us or you are against us. Those are the symbols of Jacksonian America. And they continue. And you can see throughout U.S. history that strain has been important, but it has been a minority strain. A Jacksonian foreign policy is unilateralist at heart. It favors hard power over soft power. It seeks to shed burdens, not share them. Jacksonians are not interested in democracy promotion or multilateral processes. The president wants to slash U.S. support for the United Nations. He wants to gut U.S. development assistance. He wants to abandon U.S. commitments to the Paris Climate Change Accord. He wants, quote, reciprocity in trade deals, and he wants to buy American, hire American. He wants to slash our diplomacy, especially the State Department. I'm sorry about that. But he wants to boost our military. Jacksonians see European allies as potential value-added partners when it comes to confronting challenges such in the Middle East or terrorism, but they really bristle, and you saw it yesterday in Brussels. Whenever they think Europeans are free-riding on American defense expenditures or are trying to help America's enemies through trade or other means, or constrain American sovereignty or freedom of action, or try to extend European ways to American shores. Jacksonian America represents that America. It's always been a minority current, but it has an ascendancy today. The Jacksonian impulse is to retrench. It's to pull back from Europe. But let me argue that for all of Donald Trump's Sturm und Drang, I would suggest the United States retains three core interests with regard to Europe that are bigger than Trump and that will outlive his presidency. First, the U.S. has enduring interest in a Europe that is hospitable to freedom and open to American goods, ideas, and investments. Jacksonians are less willing than others to invest significant energy or resources to advance this interest, but they recognize that America's democracy is likely to be more secure in a world in which other democracies flourish. Second, the United States has an interest in a Europe that is free of the kind of strife that draws inordinate resources from the United States and the rest of the world. Jacksonians would be the first to cheer if Europeans prove capable of resolving European conflicts on their own. Unfortunately, this has not proven to be the case, despite our own hopes. This is demonstrated by the just recently, Russian-Ukrainian, Russian-Georgia conflicts, the Balkan Wars, and in America's continued military presence and our peacekeeping forces, our efforts at reconciliation and reassurance that, at European invitation, continue here today. And third, there's a common agreement that the United States has a very keen interest in a confident, capable, outward-looking Europe that can be a partner with the United States to address a whole range of issues far from European or American shores that no country, not even a superpower, is going to be able to deal with on its own. And Jacksonians are reluctant to invest American energy or resources in sort of global do-gooding, as they would call it, but they're not averse to see other countries step in and deal with many of those challenges. That's why I say it's about burden shedding, not sharing. And the message to Europe, not only on the NATO side, but on a range of issues, is step up, please. You have to work to deal with these issues. You might not find us there. So these core interests, I think, will guide U.S. policies, which I hope is a more optimistic note than you might read from the headlines. But it's going to be a turbulent time. It's going to be a turbulent time. Which brings me back finally to Europe and to history. Over the centuries, the nature of Europe has been defined by the nature of its center. Often it's been a crossroads, often it's been the battleground. If we bring centuries of European history up a little quicker, during the first half of the last century, Europe's center sought to dominate the continent. The result was war, depression, widespread devastation. During the next 40 years, Europe was organized by its peripheries. The result was a Cold War, massive military buildups, and a divided continent, half of which prospered and half of which stagnated. And then 28 years ago, Europe's middle sent the signal again and tore down those walls and again shaped the continent. So I suggest today we've come to the end of another cycle of our history. And let me suggest that the dream of Europe that is whole, free, and at peace can only be realized when we recognize that Europe's future will again be determined by the nature of its center, not the preoccupations of its peripheries. For untold generations, the nations of Europe's center have been extinguished, and reborn. Peoples have been pushed across frontiers. Just think of this one personal example. A 99-year-old woman who lives in Galicia was born in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. She became of age in the Polish Republic. She survived World War II as a Soviet citizen under German occupation. She was reintegrated into the Ukrainian SSR. And for the past 19 years, she's lived as a citizen of Ukraine. And she hasn't even left her house. She's seen the two worst wars in history and the Cold War begin in her neighborhood. She has lived through colored revolutions, red, black, red, white, orange, blue. She walks down the streets of her hometown of Lviv, Lvov, Lemberg. She sees the past everywhere. In the marble steps of the Habsburgs, and the German names engraved on public fixtures, in the Baroque church of the old Polish Commonwealth, in the cracked windows of the synagogue or in the courtyard of the Armenian church, in the buildings dedicated to Hungarian merchants or adorned with Yiddish or Cyrillic inscriptions. The past is everywhere. But the question that should preoccupy us today, now, is where her children and her grandchildren see their future. Today, this region of shifting borders and peoples, one whose turmoil so often rippled across the continent, is again our frontier of opportunity and obligation. Of the opportunity to consolidate progress of past decades toward a continent that is truly whole, free, and at peace, and the obligation, once again, to see it through. And once again, the United States and its partners face a choice between retrenchment or engagement. Part of Europe's center is integrated into the European and Euro-Atlantic mainstream, but another part is not. The prospects of those countries becoming members of the European Union or Euro-Atlantic institutions at any time now, if we are honest, is low. On the whole, they've been less successful in their economic and political reforms. They've yet to resolve a lot of their lingering bilateral tensions, or not frozen, but festering conflicts, and they're roiled by ethnic and nationalist disputes. Moscow is suspicious of any effort by them to forge closer bonds with the West, and both the US and the EU are distracted by our own challenges. But the alternative is to leave tens of millions of Europeans suspended between a prosperous democratic EU and authoritarian Eurasia and a turbulent Middle East. And as we know to our sorrow, such in-between lands are often the cockpits of violence and conflict and geopolitical competition. It's where the wars start. Through our actions together, we can and we must set ourselves a historic goal. No more gray zones of Europe. No more Zwischeneuropa. The ability of governments in the region to deal with these issues and the willingness of Europe and the United States to work together with them and with Russia could determine not only where Europe ends, but more importantly, what Europe represents. And if we fail to engage now, if we succumb to this comfortable tendency to retrench, we, Americans and Europeans together, could end up paying a much higher price later. So despite transatlantic turbulence, I believe America will stand with Europe. But Europeans must work together to chart the way forward. And as so often in the past, signals from Europe's center are likely to prove decisive. That is the lesson of the Marshall Plan. That is the lesson of 1989. That is the lesson of our partnership. And that is the lesson of history. Thank you.
Dan, for a very interesting speech. And now I will open the floor for you, for your questions, and I will ask Danielle to answer them. And if you pose the question, please introduce yourself very briefly. Thank you.
Good morning, Andrew Jonas. Thank you very much for an excellent overview. I think the Marshall Plan represents a changed attitude to Germany. If I remember correctly, it was the Morgenthau Plan to keep Germany down and to put limits on steel production, on industrial capacity, etc. Whereas George Marshall realized, under pressure from Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, that in fact Germany was key. And that if you wanted to create an open market in Europe, you really had to reconstruct Germany to help reconstruct Europe. With that lesson, I wonder if you could go more deeply into Germany's role today. It is in the center of Europe, after all. And what integrating role it can play. And maybe as a footnote, I would just mention that John Maynard Keynes, who played a key role at the Bretton Woods Conference, suggested that surpluses of exporting nations be confiscated rather than kept. And so behind the Marshall Plan, there was a very elaborate system of settlement and payment system, which is relevant in today's tensions between North and South, the problems that Italy, Greece, Portugal face. Thank you.
Good. Sure. That's fine.
One more question. Anybody else?
Well, can I speak? Vít Smetana. Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture, which I really enjoyed. I have just one minor comment. When you talked about the US withdrawal from Western Bohemia, I don't know whether you meant it as a criticism that basically the country was left at the mercy of the Soviet Union and the Soviet army. I would just like to point out that actually the two armies withdrew from the Czechoslovakian territory together by the beginning of December 1945. It was actually the Czechoslovak communists who very much pressured that the US forces should withdraw just them from Western Bohemia, and President Beneš decided to use it as a leverage how to get rid of the Soviets as well, and to restore the full sovereignty over the whole of the Czechoslovakian territory. In fact, technically, the Soviet army returned to Czechoslovakia only in 1968. In 1945, it was very surprising that actually Truman, upon Beneš's wish, sent a letter to Stalin suggesting a parallel withdrawal of both armies, and very surprisingly Stalin agreed. But let us comment that basically Stalin very much knew very well that he was risking nothing because of the strength of the Czechoslovakian communists in the country and so on. So that's just my minor comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, so well, I obviously agree with that. My point was the result was that the U.S. had stepped back from this region. Part of it was also agreements we had made earlier in the war in terms of how we would divide Germany and Europe, and we also advanced, liberated Leipzig, and we're into deep of what became the GDR, and also retreated. On the other hand, the Soviets took Berlin, and actually they retreated from the western sectors of Berlin as part of the agreement. So I think the point, if you think about all the countries, not just Germany, but also Austria and here, it was a time, it was unclear, it was uncertain. We had no rules, we had no way to negotiate with each other, it was very uncertain. This was our ally, after all, during the World War. So it only became clear over time what was really happening and whether we could engage. The United States demilitarized completely from Europe. It gave lots of money, but then the troops weren't there. They had to come back. We tend to forget that the U.S. troops actually came back to Europe after World War II. They didn't just stay here. It's a complicated history. The result, though, was what we have lived with. And I think that was my point about lessons, about engagement or not. Well, we could have a whole other lecture on Germany. One point about the Marshall Plan I think is interesting was what you alluded to, called the European Payments Union, which you could say was almost a forerunner of what is now sort of the Eurozone in a way. Again, at American assistance, that the Europeans had to come together and figure out these types of arrangements. And if you read, George Kennan, as well as George Marshall, George Kennan was very important in the development of the Marshall Plan. They will all say Europe's greatest weakness will be its fragmentation. And Europe will never recover unless it gets over that fragmentation. That's a pretty contemporary message. And it comes from the Americans. So the idea that the U.S. wants to divide Europe or make sure it's all fractured, that's not in the U.S. interest. We have always seen that only a big single market, a big type of coming together, and a lot of things, and that's the message, again, of the Marshall Plan, that it is a U.S. interest that Europe do that. It's not just a favor. And that's why I believe our interests will guide us in an enduring way beyond this or that president. But back to Germany. So let me think. I think the point has been, there was this famous, sometimes the chattering class, the people like me, they get hung up on little slogans. And you mentioned the Marshallova Plan, but after that there was a quote by Lord Ismay, about NATO that said the point of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. But I've had this argument with my German friends for a long time. That was actually wrong. The point of NATO was to ratchet Germany back up, not to keep it down, but to do it in a way so it was embedded in a broader community, which was also at the time the German interests. And so that Germany would be so interlinked with its neighbors and that its interests would coincide that it wouldn't be this, too strong for Europe type of history. So if we think about it today, Germany is the most interlinked probably of all the countries of Europe. It has no borders. The only border it has is with Switzerland because of the Schengen arrangement. It has no borders, really. And its defense is now defended on the Polish eastern border or in the Baltics, where its troops are at Latvian invitation. This is amazing if we think about it. But of course, part of the German role in Europe today, I think, is accentuated by a few factors. One is the, if I may say, the default of all the other major European countries. The UK is leaving. It's in crisis, frankly, in terms of what its role is. The French have gone through, huge turmoil, are likely to continue. Poland, has not sort of stepped up as a European leader. Spain has gone through lots of turmoil. Italy has huge challenges. So part of Germany's enhanced role at the moment is not because the Germans sought it, but because everyone else has, had so many problems. And I think Chancellor Merkel has shown this consistency that, again, many other leaders haven't. So she's sort of seen as an orientation point. So I think personality matters. I think sort of the context matters. But one thing that my German friends might not appreciate as much, I think the role of the United States in Europe has always been partly to also reassure other European countries about Germany. We don't do that very loudly. But a continent in which people know the United States is there is a continent that's less worried about a dominant Deutschland. And if we're not there, some of these older concerns might arise. We don't think about it in that way today because of the kind of Europe we have, but when we're faced with real choices again about retrenchment or not, this is another factor to consider. So Germany is part of Europe's center, but it's not its center. This country is part of its center. If you think about the old traditions of Central Europe, Mitteleuropa, they were all between cities. And as I said, it wasn't about borders, it was about connections. It was about how this or that city connected with others, and it was very vibrant between Prague and all the other cities of this space. And I think that, again, the crossroads is really an important function for this part of Europe. So I think Germany will continue. It seems to be, in a fairly stable situation. My impression is, again, my German friends won't like this, but I do tell it to them. I said there is a psychological island at the moment. If you go to Berlin, you go to Munich, Hamburg, life is good. And you take an hour flight from there, life's not so good. And whether they understand, the implications of that, I wonder. I had to do this once. The distance from Kiev to Berlin is the same as from Boston to Chicago. But it's another world. We're still treating Ukraine as if it's another planet. And it's just right down the street. It is Central Europe. Much of Europe's future will be decided there. And that's our choice. Do we engage, continue, even though we're all fatigued by all this and have our own problems? Or do we step back? I think that's the choice we have to face, ultimately. The Ukrainians, have lots of issues on their own, but in the end, it's really about that type of future.
Sorry, the division of labor between Germany and the US?
On everything?
On this issue.
Oh, well, I think the U.S. should be much more engaged than it is on Ukraine, absolutely. We should either be part of the Minsk process or well, I think we should be part of the Minsk process, frankly. So how it comes about that we're not, I think, frankly, the president is unclear about where he stands on Ukraine, which is troubling. I think U.S. and excuse me to my colleagues here at the embassy. I think all of his secretaries and all of those in office have the right talking points, and it's basically continuity of the U.S. approach. But you can just tell people just don't know if that's true or not. The Congress is completely committed to Ukraine and disagrees fundamentally with the president, including most Republicans. So there's a strong consensus in the United States Congress about supporting what's going on in the reform process in Ukraine. But ultimately, where we go, it's hard to tell. And that's why I want to just underscore the strategic importance of this part of Europe. The orientation, the nature of this part of Europe, and I mean the broader Central Europe, will determine Europe's future. It is just absolutely clear. And it will take, the peripheries get distracted, also the Russians. But if we understand what's at stake here, I think you could see that we will stand with you. But I'm unclear about what the signals are also from this part of Europe at the moment. When I talk about illiberal democracy, I think we have to recognize that that is a challenge that's bigger than this or that country. It's a cancer. Either you root out the cancer or you let it continue to infect the body. And I think those are the challenges we have to face. The U.S. should be involved. You heard this is a long-standing slogan. We are not a power in Europe, we are a European power. The United States is so integral to all the coalitions and balances that Europeans construct to get along with each other. If you pull that out, I don't want to know the consequences.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. Okay, over there. Yeah.
Professor Hamilton, Charles Ross, European Anti-Corruption Center. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come to Prague. And I'd also like to thank the Václav Havel Library and the American Embassy for making this important event happen. It takes a little vision to see the needs of the future and to know the answers today. And your talk today demonstrates that vision is important. We have a problem in Central and Eastern Europe. From the Václav Havel Library, we can drive overnight to the only European war since World War II. It's an easy drive. But I believe many people in this room share the idea that the success of the Revolution of Dignity of Ukraine is of strategic importance to the West. I would appreciate, please, Professor, your perspectives on how to accelerate the reintegration of Ukraine into the Western free and open marketplace and the principles of democracy and fair trade and appropriate open government. Thank you.
One last question.
Perhaps I'm Norma Hervey. I live in Prague, but I'm also from the United States, a retired historian from Luther College. And I want to ask you if there's...
Iowa.
Right. Wanted to ask you if you think there is any possibility in perhaps the post-Putin era of integrating Russia into Europe.
Okay, two short questions there. On Ukraine, I mean, I think I'm realistic about the prospects here. That the prospect of further enlargement or sort of the notion of that, I think, is not on for a generation. I say that with sorrow, but I think you have to orient policy to some sort of reality. So the Juncker Commission has said it's not on their agenda. I believe it won't be on the agenda of the next European Commission, so that you add another 5 years. We're talking about a cycle of a 15-year space at least. if we're realistic. And there might be this or that small little Balkan country that gets in, but even there, I'm doubtful. So we have to approach now this region with a sense of this generational perspective. You know, it sounds like too daunting, but you know, step back for a moment. 1989 happened, but when did Poland, the Czech Republic, and others join the EU? It took a generation. It was hard work, and that was favorable circumstance. You know, they didn't join the EU for another 15 years or so. So NATO went first, but even that was not automatic. So we have to rid ourselves that this is going to be easy or fast, and that we have to have a sense of what to do in the meantime. So my view is you have to look at the activities we've been engaged with. The European Union ultimately is the force that has to think about wider Europe. I was troubled by the Juncker paper that was released, 6 weeks ago? It was called The Future of Europe. And not one word in that document, not one, about tens of millions of Europeans who weren't part of the European Union. It was not about the future of Europe. It was an inward-looking document about a group that's struggling with itself. And to say it's about the future of Europe already tells you all you want to know about the vision thing. So, unfortunately, that's where we're starting. But the EU has developed some mechanisms. The Eastern Partnership, I believe, was well-intentioned, but it was conducted, again, under the same old framework, which was you fill the acquis communautaire stack of things you've got to do like this, and you can become one of us. You know, these countries are not able to do that. They're not going to become Luxembourg tomorrow. And so rather than do that, it seems to me you have to tailor the Eastern Partnership to the specific needs of a country, because the Eastern Partnership was sort of just, it's all the same for everybody. And make it visible to people that this stuff will make a difference in their lives. I dealt when I was in the U.S. government with the Balkans, and we had to show people after the Balkan Wars that all of this stuff about joining, the mainstream made a difference. Why would they care? And I spent more time in Brussels than in the Balkans. Basically, talking to my EU colleagues that you've got to show people, real people, why this makes a difference. If you're going to build a bridge, put up a big sign that says, brought to you by the people of the European Union. Build a highway, do that, right? And we had some success. It's still troubling, but I think you have to think that way. You have to start on the ground. You have to appeal to what people can hardly get through their day in these countries. Corruption undermines their possibilities. There's all sorts of things that are just not, they don't have time for a vision. So we have to make the vision practical and not some ethereal thing. So I think the EU needs to really think hard about that, and whether it's really invested in doing this or not, I'm not so sure at the moment. I think the US, again, we play the supporting role. We're not going to be the decisive factor, but the fact that we are there is important to the credibility of the entire process. I just give one example, again, in the Balkans. We have a small, of the military forces in the Balkans, the US now has almost none, except for a very small unit in Kosovo. And the EU has lots of stuff going on. But I can tell you, the Kosovars, the only credible unit that they believe in is the American one. And if that would go, the rest of it would be in trouble. So again, some small US engagement often makes a big difference. So again, back on Ukraine, we need to provide them, I think, with more support, including lethal military support so they can defend themselves. We have to get much more engaged in the Minsk process. We have to call the Russians out and hold them accountable to basic violations of international norms, which we do. So that's one track. I can go to the Russia piece. So one is you hold Russia to account. You don't step back on the sanctions. You don't step back on Crimea, including not just the Donbass and so on. The second is, I think, we have an interest with Russia of not letting our relations deteriorate so much that we could run into some unanticipated accident or problem that nobody really wants. The problem we have is our relations with Russia are probably worse since Mr. Gorbachev's time, or before probably. And even in the Cold War, when it was with the Soviet Union, we had rules of the road to manage a global conflict. Those have all deteriorated. Our forces don't even really talk to each other. On the military side, you see with the problems in Syria, and up here, we have the same issues. You have, jets turning off their transponders and buzzing cities. An accident can happen easily. And if we don't, we have a mutual interest in making sure that those things don't happen and that we can engage. So looking at all the documents, all the confidence building measures that we had created, and trying to revive as many of them as we can seems to be a practical thing to do. Often our Russian friends aren't interested in doing that at the moment. And we have some real challenges coming up, which is the U.S. accusation of the Russians violating the INF Treaty. This will be coming from the Washington establishment an issue. I don't know what the president really thinks about it, but I think if you let the establishment continue the trajectory, this will be a confrontation with the Russians. It will force the U.S. and NATO to think about ways to deal with that. And we've gone through one INF crisis in the past. We might be heading for another one. But the president, views Russia as maybe an opportunity to try to figure out some way to work with them. He just surprised the EU leaders yesterday with his vision of that. One way to think about the U.S., we're going to live with this tension for 4 years at least, between what I call, this is an English kind of wordplay, between temperament and temperance. So the president's a temperamental person. He tweets his foreign policy at 3 in the morning, 9 a.m. your time, so you can start your day. But what have we seen? We have seen, frankly, that his advisors, his team, the Congress, our judges, also yesterday an important decision, have sort of put him in and channel him into more of a mainstream approach to things. So what he says or tweets and what is really U.S. policy isn't always, frankly, the same. But knowing the difference is the tension we're going to live with. Because on many issues, he does channel into a mainstream approach, and then all of a sudden there's something else. And his advisors can't control that. So that's the tension we're going to live with. It's going to be an America that's going to be unpredictable. I think we have deeper interests that will keep us connected, like I said, but we're going to live with this for a time. So the opportunity with Russia, I think, is you hold them account when they violate basic rules. You try to engage with them wherever you can on mutual areas of interest, also like North Korea or other things like that. And third, my last point, hardest point, difficult, I get it. But again, thinking of where we are, we have to engage Russian society, we have to engage Russians. Maybe governments don't do that, because that's what gets them all nervous. But civil society, our societies, we should be engaging with our Russian, citizens, and do that as much as we can. It's very hard. The Kremlin shuts down groups. They don't allow a lot of this to happen. Very hard. I don't disagree. But again, if we have a generational perspective in mind, you just do it. You do it as much as you can, whatever you can. Make a small difference every day. And I believe we can engage with Russian society in ways that can be transformative. But it's not going to be easy. And in the end, we have to want to do that. That's my main concern. I'm not sure on either side of the Atlantic, we still want to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for your very interesting remarks and lecture. So thank you once again, and thank you for coming.
You.